The cameras found him first, the way cameras always found Jae-hoon Kang. He stood at the center of a glass stage in Seoul, the city's skyline burning gold behind him, while an auditorium of executives rose to applaud a man they admired and did not know. The award in his hand was heavier than it looked. So was the silence behind his eyes. People thought Jae-hoon Kang had everything: money, power, a name that opened doors before he reached them. What they did not know, what no headline had ever captured, was that somewhere along the way to becoming Korea's most celebrated CEO, he had built a wall so high around his own heart that even he had forgotten what was on the other side of it. Backstage, his assistants praised his speech. His board members shook his hand and spoke of quarterly growth. Nobody asked if he was happy. Nobody ever did. He answered questions about strategy and innovation with the practiced calm of a man who had long ago decided that feelings were a liability he could not afford. And tonight, like every night, he went home to an apartment with a view of the entire city and not a single photograph of anyone he loved. 3 days earlier, in a boardroom on the 41st floor of Kang Innovations, the truth beneath the trophy had already begun to surface. The company's youth division was hemorrhaging market share. A rival startup half their size had captured the very customers Kang Innovations had built its empire on, and the board, restless and frightened, wanted answers. "We need fresh thinking," said one of the senior directors. "An outside strategist. Someone who has worked in Western markets, who understands a generation we have stopped speaking to." Jae-hoon did not look up from the report in front of him. "Someone from outside our world cannot understand our company," he said, in the flat, final tone that ended most disagreements before they began. "We built this on Korean values. We will rebuild it the same way." Min Se-ok, his closest friend since university and now his most trusted advisor, caught his eye across the table with the particular look he reserved for moments when Jae-hoon was about to make a mistake disguised as conviction. He said nothing in the room. He would say it later, the way he always did in the elevator, where Jae-hoon could not escape him. "You didn't even consider it," Min Se-ok said as the doors closed. "I considered it. I rejected it." "You rejected it before you heard the name." Jae-hoon's jaw tightened. "I don't need a stranger explaining our culture to me." "No," Min Se-ok said quietly. "You need someone willing to tell you the truth. The question is whether you'd recognize it if it didn't come wrapped in a Korean accent." Jae-hoon did not answer. He never did, when Min Se-ok was right. Half a world and one connecting flight away, Naomi Carter watched Seoul rise out of the clouds and felt something settle in her chest that she could only describe as recognition, even though she had never set foot in this country before. Her father had told her stories about it her whole childhood, the markets, the mountains, the language he had taught her in fragments before life pulled them in different directions. She had grown up between two worlds and belonged fully to neither, and somewhere in her 31 years, she had stopped waiting for permission to belong and started building her own. She had degrees most rooms underestimated, and a track record that should have silenced any doubt before she opened her mouth. And still, in her first week in Seoul, she felt the same quiet, practiced skepticism she had felt in boardrooms from New York to London. Eyes that lingered a half-second too long. Questions phrased as tests. A junior analyst who explained with great patience a concept she had pioneered. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that anger, however justified, was the easiest way to be dismissed. Instead, she let her work answer for her, the way water answers stone, slowly and without apology. The position she applied for at Kang Innovations was 3 levels beneath what her resume merited. She did not care. She wanted the company, not the title, and the company, she had read in every report she could find, was a brilliant machine quietly losing its soul. The interview took place in a glass room on the 40th floor, one floor below where the real decisions were made. But Jae-hoon Kang, restless and unconvinced by his own board, had decided to sit in. He watched the woman across the table answer questions with a composure that unsettled him more than confidence usually did. There was no performance in it. She was not trying to impress him. She was simply telling the truth as she saw it and waiting to see if he was serious enough to hear it. "Do you really think you can understand a company built on Korean values?" He asked, the same line he had used in the boardroom 3 days earlier, sharper now because it was aimed at a person instead of an idea. Naomi held his gaze. "Values are not owned by one culture," she said. "They are proven by actions. I have studied this company for 2 weeks. I can tell you exactly where your values and your actions stopped matching if you would like." The room went very still. Somewhere behind her composed expression, Naomi felt her own heart pounding, the specific fear of a woman who has decided to speak truth to power and is waiting to see if it costs her everything. But she did not look away. She had learned that lesson from her father, too. The door only opens for people willing to knock as if they deserve to walk through it. Jae-hoon said nothing for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the unmistakable flicker of a man who has just been told something true and does not know what to do with it. She got the job. He told himself it was because her analysis was sound. He did not examine, that night or for many nights after, why he kept thinking about the way she had looked at him without flinching. Naomi's first month at Kang Innovations confirmed everything she suspected and revealed a great deal she had not. The company was extraordinary in its discipline and starving in its imagination. Meetings ran with military precision and produced nothing new. Junior employees sat in silence, their best ideas dying quietly in notebooks they were too afraid to open in front of senior staff. Everyone in the building, she came to understand, was afraid of the man on the top floor, not because he was cruel, but because he was unreadable, and unreadable men are the ones people fear most. She began doing what she had always done. She listened. She asked the quietest person in every meeting what they actually thought, and she wrote it all down. And within 3 weeks, she had assembled a proposal that addressed not the company's marketing problem, which was what the board kept arguing about, but its trust problem, which was the real and unspoken wound beneath everything else. Jae-hoon rejected it without reading past the first page. He launched his own initiative instead, a top-down rebrand built on his own instincts. Expensive, polished, and utterly disconnected from the generation it was meant to reach. It failed within 6 weeks, publicly enough to make the financial press. And on the night the numbers came in, Jae-hoon sat alone in his office long after the building had emptied and finally, reluctantly, opened the proposal he had dismissed. He read it twice, then a third time. By the third reading, he understood, with the specific humiliation of a brilliant man forced to admit someone else had seen further than he had, that she was right about almost all of it. He did not apologize the next morning. He simply implemented her plan, quietly, without crediting its source in the meeting where he presented it as his own evolved thinking. Naomi noticed. She said nothing, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. She had not come to Korea to win arguments. She had come to change a company, and the company was, slowly, beginning to change. Employees who had been afraid to speak began bringing ideas directly to her. A culture of fear does not dissolve overnight, but it had begun to crack, light entering through seams that had been sealed for years. Jae-hoon, watching from his glass office on the floor above, found himself unsettled by something he could not name. People listened to her, not because of her title, which remained modest, not because of fear, which she never used. They listened because she had earned, quietly and consistently, the one currency he had never learned to spend: trust. "Why do people listen to her?" he asked Min-seok one evening, "when she has no real authority here?" Min-seok smiled in the particular way of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something obvious. "Because she gives them respect before she asks for results. You give them results and call it respect." Jae-hoon did not answer that night either, but he found himself, more and more often, lingering near the floor where she worked, finding reasons to walk past her desk that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with a question he was not yet ready to ask himself. He found her there late one evening, long after the office had emptied, the city lights scattered like static across the window behind her. She was still working, her sleeves pushed up, 3 screens open, utterly absorbed. "You should go home," he said, the closest thing to small talk he had attempted with her in 2 months. "You're still here," she said, not looking up. "It's my company. It's my work." He almost smiled. Almost. He sat down across from her instead, in the chair usually reserved for people who feared him, and asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. "Why do you work this hard? You don't need this job. Your resume could open 10 doors brighter than this one." Naomi finally looked up. There was no performance in her answer, only the plain weight of something true. "My father used to tell me that when people close a door in your face, you build your own. I've spent my whole life proving I belong in rooms people didn't think I should be in. I'm not doing this for promotion. I'm doing it because I refuse to be the kind of person who gives up just because someone else decided I shouldn't be here." Something in Jae-hoon's chest, something old and carefully buried, responded to that sentence in a way numbers and acquisitions never had. He thought, for the first time in longer than he could remember, of his mother, of the silence that had swallowed his family after she died, of the version of himself that had once believed in things larger than control. He said none of this aloud. He simply nodded, and for a moment the silence between them was not awkward but companionable. 2 people who had each built their own doors and were, without quite admitting it, beginning to walk through each other's. The change in him was small at first, the kind of change only someone watching closely would notice. He began greeting the staff in the elevator instead of staring at his phone. He asked questions in meetings instead of issuing verdicts. He found himself, more than once, deferring to Naomi's read of a room before trusting his own, and each time he did, something in him loosened slightly, like a fist that had finally, after years, begun to unclench. "She's changing the company," Min-seok observed one afternoon, watching Jae-hoon laugh, actually laugh, at something a junior designer had said in a meeting. "No," Jae-hoon said, surprising himself with the honesty of it. "She's changing me." What grew between them after that was not a romance built on grand gestures. It was built in increments too small to name and too consistent to ignore. Dinners that began as work sessions and ended 2 hours past the last business topic. A late-night phone call when his father's harsh words after a difficult shareholder meeting had left him hollow, and Naomi, without being asked, simply stayed on the line until his voice steadied. A morning when she arrived to find a coffee on her desk, his second favorite roast remembered correctly, with no note and no need for one. She discovered, piece by piece, the loneliness beneath his composure. A boy who had lost his mother too young and learned that love was the one investment that never paid him back. A son who had spent 2 decades trying to earn a father's approval that arrived, when it arrived at all, wrapped in conditions. He discovered her resilience was not hardness, but its opposite. A woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had decided, every single time, to answer that underestimation with excellence instead of bitterness. For the first time since his mother died, Jae-hoon found himself wanted by someone who had nothing to gain from wanting him. Naomi was not interested in his money, had never once asked about his company's valuation, had turned down, with a politeness that left no room for argument, the expensive gifts his assistant had once tried to arrange on his behalf as a gesture he hadn't fully thought through. What she wanted, it became clear, was simply him, the version of him that was emerging slowly from underneath the armor, and that, more than any acquisition he had ever closed, terrified and steadied him in equal measure. The first time he kissed her, it was not planned. It happened on a balcony outside a company gala neither of them had wanted to attend, after he had walked away mid-conversation with an investor to find her standing alone with the city below them, and he had said, without any of his usual calculation, "I don't know how to do this. I have never wanted to know someone the way I want to know you." She had looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the performance she had learned to expect from powerful men, and found none. The kiss that followed was slow and certain, the opposite of everything either of them had rehearsed for boardrooms, and for one night, the walls around both of their hearts came down at exactly the same time. It did not last. Things built on a single night rarely survive what comes next, and what came next arrived with the particular cruelty of a family that had spent generations protecting its name above everything else. Chairman Kang summoned his son to the family estate on a Sunday evening that Jae-hoon would remember afterward, as the night 2 versions of his life finally collided. His father did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply set down a folder of photographs, taken from a distance, of Jae-hoon and Naomi leaving a restaurant together, and said, "You are the face of this family. You cannot forget who you are." "I haven't forgotten anything," Jae-hoon said. "I have remembered, for the first time in years, what it feels like to want something for myself. This is not about wanting," his father said. "This is about image, about 100 years of reputation that does not bend for one woman, however impressive she may be on paper. The board will not accept this. The shareholders will not accept this. And I," he paused, the weight of the sentence deliberate, "will not accept this." Jae-hoon left the estate that night with a calm exterior and a storm underneath it. The old, familiar instinct to comply warring against something newer and more fragile, the instinct to choose. He did not yet know which one would win, and the not knowing frightened him more than his father's disapproval ever had. The scandal, when it came, did not come from his father directly. It came from a rival executive who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. An old interview surfacing online in which a younger Jae-hoon, defending a controversial hiring policy years earlier, had used language about international employees that read, in the cold light of the present, as dismissive at best and prejudiced at worst. The internet did what the internet does. The story metastasized within hours, headlines accusing Kang innovations of hypocrisy, demanding to know why a man with this history had elevated a black foreign strategist to such visible influence within his company. Investors grew nervous. The board demanded a statement. And somewhere in the noise, the very thing the headlines claimed to be defending, Naomi herself, was the one left standing in the wreckage, watching the man she had begun to trust be revealed as someone who had once believed, at least in part, the things she had spent her whole career fighting against. She found the original interview herself, before anyone could explain it to her, before Jae-hoon could find the words to soften it. She read his old sentences twice, feeling something in her chest she recognized too well, the particular grief of discovering that someone you have let close to you once stood, even briefly, on the other side of a line that defined your entire life. She did not yell when she confronted him. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. She simply stood in his office, her voice steady even as her hands were not, and said the sentence that would haunt him longer than any headline. I did not expect you to be perfect. I expected you to be honest. You let me find out who you used to be from a stranger's article instead of your own mouth. It was years ago, he said, the words sounding hollow even to him as he spoke them. I have changed. Maybe, she said, but I can forgive mistakes. I cannot build a future on someone who refuses to be honest about them while they're happening. She walked out before he could answer, and the door closing behind her was quieter than he expected and louder than anything he had heard in years. He did not sleep that night, or the one after. He sat alone in the apartment with the view of the whole city and understood, for the first time with total clarity, that he had spent his entire adult life mistaking control for strength and silence for dignity, and that both of those mistakes had just cost him the one person who had ever asked him to be honest instead of impressive. He thought of his father's voice, of the family lessons absorbed so early he had never thought to question them. That image mattered more than truth. That strength meant never admitting weakness. That love was a transaction best avoided because it could not be controlled. He thought of his mother, who had died trying to live inside those same rules, who had smiled in photographs and crumbled in private, and he understood, with a grief that arrived 20 years late, that he had built his entire life as a monument to the wrong lesson. He did not call Naomi that week. He knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that an apology offered in panic would mean nothing. So instead he did something he had never done before in his career. He stopped trying to control the story, and he told the truth. He called a press conference without his father's permission, without his board's approval, and without a single line of corporate language softening the edges of what he needed to say. He stood in front of the cameras that had once celebrated him and said, "The biggest failure of my company was not losing money. It was believing we could judge people before understanding them. I said something years ago that I am ashamed of. I will not pretend it does not reflect who I was. I can only show you, through what I do next, who I am trying to become." The board was furious. His father did not speak to him for 3 weeks. The stock dipped before it steadied, and several senior investors threatened to walk. But something else happened too, something that mattered more in the end than any of it. Employees who had spent years afraid of him began, cautiously, to trust him. Naomi, watching the press conference from her apartment alone, felt something in her chest she had not expected to feel again so soon. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the smallest, most fragile beginning of respect. She did not return immediately. When he came to her, 2 weeks later, asking her to come back to the company, she refused, gently but completely. "I need to know the change is real," she said, "not temporary. I have spent my whole life watching powerful men say the right things when the cameras are on. I am not interested in being someone's redemption arc." He nodded, and instead of arguing, he did the only thing that could possibly answer her doubt. He changed, slowly, deliberately, with no audience watching. He restructured the company's hiring practices from the ground up, removing the quiet biases that had shaped decisions for a decade without anyone naming them aloud. He created mentorship programs for employees from backgrounds the company had always claimed to value and never actually invested in. He sat, more than once, in rooms with his father and the board, and refused to back down, not with anger, but with the calm, immovable conviction of a man who had finally decided what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. Minsiok watched the transformation with the particular satisfaction of a friend who had waited years for it. "You used to lead with fear," he told Jae-hoon one evening. "Now you lead with something else. I'm not sure you have a word for it yet." "I think the word is humility," Jae-hoon said. "I think she taught it to me without ever saying the word out loud." Months passed. The company that had been hemorrhaging its best young talent began, slowly, to win it back. The culture Naomi had tried to build in her first weeks, the one Jae-hoon had once dismissed, took root not because he ordered it to, but because he had finally become the kind of leader people wanted to follow into it. He did not call Naomi during those months, not because he had stopped thinking about her, but because he understood, finally, that the proof she needed could not be delivered in words. It had to be lived, quietly, for long enough that it could not be mistaken for performance. When she returned, it was not because he asked her to. It was because she heard, through people who had no reason to lie to her, that the company had become something genuinely different, and her own curiosity, the same curiosity that had brought her to Korea in the first place, pulled her back through the doors she had once walked out of. She walked into Kang Innovations not as a junior strategist this time, but as the company's new chief innovation officer, a title that belonged to her not because anyone gave it to her, but because the entire industry now recognized what the people inside the building had known for over a year. She was no longer the outsider whose presence required explanation. She was, by every measure that mattered, one of the most respected leaders in Korea's business world, the architect of a transformation that business journals were already calling one of the most remarkable turnarounds the country's corporate culture had seen in a generation. Jae-hoon found her on her first evening back, in the same glass office where she had once stayed late, and he had once asked her, clumsily, why she worked so hard. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring a ring, not yet. He brought a letter, handwritten, the first thing he had written by hand in years that was not a signature. She read it slowly, standing by the window with the city she had once arrived in as a stranger spread out beneath her, now a place that had, somehow, become home. The letter did not apologize for what had happened. It had moved past apology into something steadier. It simply said, in his careful, unpracticed handwriting, that she had shown him a world he had been too proud to see, and that everything he had become in the past year, the leader, the son who had finally stopped performing for his father's approval, the man capable of standing in front of cameras and telling the truth even when it cost him, All of it existed because she had refused, from the very first interview, to let him underestimate her. When she looked up, he was not holding a ring in some rehearsed, cinematic gesture. He was simply standing there, the way he had learned to stand in front of her, without armor, asking nothing except to be seen for who he had become rather than who he used to be. "I'm not asking you to complete my life," he said. "I think I finally understand that's not what this is. I'm asking because we became better people together, and I don't want to find out what kind of man I become without you." She did not answer immediately. She had spent her whole life refusing to be rescued, refusing to let any man, however powerful, define the shape of her future. But this was not a rescue. This was an offer made by an equal, a man who had torn down the very walls that once would have made loving him impossible. And when she finally said yes, it was not the yes of a woman swept off her feet, but the yes of a woman who had watched a person earn, through a year of unglamorous, unwitnessed work, the right to ask the question. Years later, the story of Jae-hoon Kang and Naomi Carter would be told in business schools, not as a romance, though it was certainly that, but as a case study in what genuine transformation looks like inside an institution that had once mistaken rigidity for strength. Kang Innovations became, under their joint leadership, one of the most admired companies in Asia, not simply for its profits, though those came too, but for a culture that had been rebuilt, brick by brick, on the principle Naomi had carried with her since she first stepped off a plane in a country that did not yet know what to make of her. That values are not owned by one culture, that they are proven every single day by actions. People would remember their story for many reasons. The unlikely beginning, the very public fall, the quiet, unglamorous redemption that took a year instead of a single grand gesture. But mostly, they would remember it because of what Naomi said, years later, in an interview she gave not as a CEO's wife, but as a leader fully in her own right, when a young reporter asked her what she had learned from loving a man who had once stood for everything she had spent her life fighting against. "Sometimes," she said, "the person we judge the fastest is the person who teaches us the most. I did not fall in love with who he was. I fell in love with the man he chose, every single day after that, to become." And somewhere in that answer was the whole truth of it, that the greatest transformation a person can offer the world is not wealth, or power, or even love itself, but the quiet, daily decision to become someone worthy of the love they have been given. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who loves unforgettable love stories. And if you're passionate about powerful Afro-Korean romances filled with emotion, culture, and unexpected twists, hit the subscribe button and become part of our family. Click the next video on your screen and let another incredible journey begin. I'll see you there.